Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this episode of the CRM Inbox series, we're going to start componentizing our design to get everything ready for the development process and apply more of a design system mentality to our UI. So here in Figma, we're going to start going through our layout by feature area and componentizing things as we go. We're going to be taking advantage of our design particles that we established in earlier episodes. So we have our color palette for both the dark and light theme, we have our type specs, as well as our spacing values that we want to use throughout our designs. So going back to our pages view, let's turn our attention to componentizing the sidebar component. I think what we'll do is just duplicate this and drag it outside of this frame so we can focus on working on it separately. So zooming into this sidebar component, let's focus on going layer by layer to get things refined. So opening up our sidebar layers, let's first establish the overall sizing of the sidebar plate. Now, based off our original reference, we have the width set at 335. I think I'd like to bring this down to more of a nice multiple of 8, something that would align better with our spacing values. So using the Control or Command and Shift key, we're going to use the left and right arrows to adjust the width. So holding Shift, it'll go in increments of 10. So I think I want this to be at a width of 320. And now just using the Control or Command and arrow keys, I'm going to bring this width down to 320 pixels wide. Next up, let's establish the vertical spacing between these larger components within our sidebar. So for this, I'm going to go to the Components tab. We can also hit Alt or Option 2. And let's open up our spacing components. And I think I'm going to drag in this 96 pixel spacer. Now hitting Alt or Option and 1, we can go back to our layer panel. And let's drag this inside of our sidebar group. Now based off this, we can quickly adjust the positioning of our logo. And we can refine this further as we get our logo flattened and neatly arranged. So turning our attention to the logo itself, let's first address this logo icon. You can see that in a previous episode, we basically created the simple shapes of the icon and then used a rotation of 18 degrees to get it to match our reference design. I like to have all of my shapes and frames align horizontally and vertically with the rest of our design, so that way we can easily space off of it. And I also like any frames around items to have nice whole pixel values, so that way it's much easier to estimate the actual pixel spacing between items. So let's open up this logo icon group. And what we're going to do is using Control or Command and E, we're going to flatten each of these vector shapes. And by flattening it, what we'll see is that the frame now aligns horizontally and vertically. It's nice and square to our artboard. And you can see there's no longer a rotation on the actual shape. So let's go through the middle and bottom, hitting Control or Command E to flatten each of those. And now you can see that all of those frames are nice and square to the rest of our design. Lastly, what I'm going to do is ungroup this temporarily. So hitting Control or Command and Shift G, we can ungroup that. And now if we reapply a group, hitting Control or Command and G, we can rename this back to logo icon. But you'll notice that the group itself is now square as well. But we have an issue with the width and height. We have decimal pixel values, which isn't going to make for the nicest spacing. So I think what I'm going to do is just assign this nice whole values that fall on our pixel scale. And you'll notice that right now we need to reset our constraints because right now it's set to scale. So let's actually back that up one step. Let's open up this group and grab each of our logo icon elements. And one thing we can do is actually componentize this immediately so that way we can set those constraints. So with the group selected, let's hit Control or Command plus Alt or Option and K to componentize this. And now we can go into each of these shapes and set the constraints to be center and center. So they'll always be pinned to the middle of whatever the frame is set to. And now we can clean up these dimensions. So let's set the width to 32 and the height to 48. And what we should see is a nice frame around it with simple values that fall on our 8-pixel scale, and the actual icon vector sits right in the middle. And with that taken care of, we can turn our attention to the logo type. And what I'd like to do is just snap it into place so it's vertically centered and aligns with the left edge of the icon. If we select both these items, we can adjust the spacing between them using this control here in the panel. And let's set that to an 8-pixel gap between these items. With that taken care of, we can also componentize the logo type itself. So we'll hit Control or Command, Alt or Option and K for that. And at this stage, we can componentize the entire logo. But what I'd like to do is bring these elements out of our sidebar so we have all of our master components in their own dedicated frames. So let's drag out a new frame. We can set the background equal to the main dark background using our theme colors. Let's rename this to Logo. And I'm going to hit Control or Command plus Shift and the left square bracket to bring this all the way to the bottom of our layers, just to keep things organized. What I'm going to do is just drag these logo components into the appropriate frame. We can get these centered up within their parent frame. So we have our logo icon and the logo type. And if we duplicate both of these, we can now focus on creating our logo group itself. So grab these two items, again, making sure that they're vertically centered. Let's adjust their spacing to be 8 pixels. And now if we hit Control or Command plus Alt or Option and K, we can componentize this and simply call it Logo. Let's clean up this frame a little bit. So what we can do is distribute the vertical spacing between these and set it to 32 pixels. Let's make sure they're all left aligned. That's looking good. And then dragging it to the top left corner, let's go down 32 pixels. And then to the right by 32 pixels. And lastly, let's size our frame to these elements by adding 32 pixels on the width and height. And we can either manually enter those values, or again, using Control or Command plus Shift and the arrow keys, we can increase the width and height manually. So I'm going to hit Control Shift and then the down key to go down by 10 pixels, 20, 30, and then releasing Shift 1, 2 more pixels. Now if we check the spacing on these items by holding Alt or Option, you should see a nice 32 margin around everything. So it's really important, even for just keeping our components organized, to make sure that we have everything nice and tidy throughout our files. They're just much better to work in. Everything looks much more professional, and it makes it really easy for developer handoff to have everything nice and polished. So that way it's clear that things aren't in a draft state. So with that logo component created, again, we can hit Alt or Option and 2 to go to our component panel. And now you can see that we have a new component group. Let's drag in an instance of that logo into our sidebar and using our spacer here, and we have everything neatly arranged. So with the logo taken care of, it's now time to address these sidebar links. And there's a couple considerations here with these sidebar links. So first off, they're all left aligned, and we have two different states to accommodate here. We have an inactive or just a normal state, as well as the active page state. We obviously have to push the text to the right, and we also have this active indicator on the left as well. So what would be best is to componentize each of these states and make it so we can have custom text for whatever link we have. And if we need to mock up various pages, we can just use instance swapping in Figma to toggle between these states. So what I'm going to do now is just create another frame here. And let's make sure we give this our main background color and rename this frame to be navigation link for the individual link component. Again, holding Control or Command plus Shift in the left bracket. We're going to send this all the way down to the bottom of our layers panel and make sure it's neatly arranged with the surrounding frames. So with this navigation link panel, what we can do is open up our sidebar layers and let's copy in both of these states that we see here that we know we have to accommodate. So we'll duplicate these and drag them into the navigation link frame. And then with those layers still selected, you can make sure they're actually positioned as needed. All right, zooming in here, we can turn our attention to getting each of these states componentized. So the first thing that we'll notice is we need to apply our actual text style for this link. And this will be the body small type spec that we created in an earlier episode. We can also make sure that the fill is set to our high contrast for the dark theme. And let's go ahead and get that applied to our other variation as well. That reminds me real quick, let's double check on our logo components to make sure all of the color swatches are applied as needed. Looks like right now they're hard-coded hex values. So let's go ahead and get everything applied as needed. So we have our logo top color, logo middle color, and logo bottom. And lastly, we just need to adjust our logo type. So that way it has the logo type spec and also the high contrast fill for the dark theme. You'll notice that the pixel value seem to have changed a little bit here. So what we want to do is resize our frame for this component to auto fit. And then in our logo component, let's double check that these are vertically centered and they still have that nice 8-pixel spacing between them. So where we dragged in that logo, we actually want to make sure it is inside of our sidebar component here. And let's just center that up within that frame as needed. All right, so sorry for jumping around there. Just wanted to make sure we got that cleaned up while we spotted it. Let's finish this out by cleaning up our component documentation page here. Just have to trim the height down by 1 pixel, and everything is looking good there. Now we can turn our attention back to these navigation links. So one thing I'd like to establish pretty quickly here is the different hover and focus states for each of the links, regardless of their active state. So I'm just going to change this to say text link, just so we have something generic to connote that this is a master component. And let's rename this to be navigation link text, and this will just be the default state. We can go ahead and componentize this, drag out a new instance. And what we're going to do is just override the text color. So we'll apply the medium contrast color here for the hover state. And we'd like to have a text decoration or border underneath this text when it's hovered. So we can zoom in here and let's just drag in a 1-pixel border along the bottom, matching that same color of medium contrast for the dark theme. Let's make sure this is part of our component layers. So we're actually going to have to add this originally to our default state. We drag that in there. And using our master component to mock this up, let's get everything arranged as needed. I want this to sit at the bottom of the line height of the text and match the width exactly. And let's make sure we rename this to be navigation link text decoration and set its constraints to be on the bottom and scale with the left and right of the component. Also make sure our text is set to scale with the left and right and always be centered within this text component. By default, this will be hidden for our normal state, and then we can override that by bringing it back for our hover state component. So we can componentize this and rename it to be the text hover. Let's move some of these other items out of the way for now so we can focus on getting these text components all set up. We can drag out another instance of our default state. So I think for this focus state, we're actually going to bring in a background color just to have a nice strong focus indicator for keyboard navigation users. Again, this is something that we'll have to incorporate in our default or master instance. So let's drag out a rectangle that matches the dimensions of this component. And this will fall below the text itself. Let's rename this to be the navigation link focus indicator. And I think what I want is for this to be the high contrast dark theme color. And what we'll do with the text is bring in the medium contrast for the light variation, so it has nice contrast between those elements. Let's make sure our background matches the actual dimensions of the text box. And just to give it a little more styling, we can apply a corner radius of 2. So again, by default, this will be hidden on our normal state, and then we can revert that color back to the normal high contrast color. But with our third instance, if we get our layers arranged here, we can turn on that focus indicator and apply that color override for medium contrast on the light theme. And lastly, we will componentize this and rename it to be the focus state for the navigation link text. Okay, I'm going to grab all of these and tidy them up. Let's establish 32 pixels of spacing between them just to keep our documentation nice and clean. And we can grab these remaining layers, drag them down further, and let's get our artboard sized a little bit larger so we have some more room to work. We'll keep these as reference below. All right, so we've addressed the various states of the actual link text. So I'm actually going to rename this. I got it backwards, but let's say link text instead of text link. And it looks like all the sizing carries through as needed. What we're going to do now is basically componentize the layout needed for the default state of the navigation link. So one interesting thing about this situation is because we are changing the position of the text between states, I don't want to have to manually adjust the layout every time we toggle between different states. So what I'd like to do is componentize some extra necessary width that we have to accommodate even in the default state to anticipate this active indicator coming in and the text being pushed off to the right. To illustrate that further, let's look at the working layers for our sidebar. And I'm going to drag out a couple rulers just to align with the different elements we have here. So what you can see is basically this margin between the left of the text in the default state and the active indicator where it begins in the active variation. Now, if we don't anticipate this needed gap or extra width on the default state, what will happen is if we toggle between these instances, we'll have to manually reposition the component to get it to left align as needed. So what I'm thinking we can do as we componentize this is have the default state anticipate this needed gutter or margin off to the left, and that'll actually affect the overall width of the component. And then what we can do is simply left align all of our instances, whether they're inactive or active, and if we toggle between the different states, we shouldn't have to manually adjust the layout of anything. Now that's my plan so far, but let's see how we would actually go about this. So the first thing I'm going to do is probably figure out how much spacing I need for the active state to work out. So I'm going to grab these two. We can pull this dashboard off to the side as just a reference. And so one thing we can do is make sure we have all of the necessary colors applied and also refine our spacing as needed. So the first thing I'd like to do is with this navigation link active indicator, I'd like to change this dimension a little bit. I think we're going to want it to be 28 pixels. And then between these two items, let's make sure they have 16 pixels spacing between them. Additionally, we'll select both, make sure they are vertically aligned to the center. And I think we can componentize this right out the gate to start working on the layout rules. So I'm going to componentize this, and let's rename this to be the navigation link. And this will be our actual active variation. We're also going to have to anticipate the different hover and focus states. So this will be the default state of that active link. Now with this componentized, what we can do is add a layout grid to help reinforce the spacing rules that we've established here. So with this layout grid, we're going to use columns. We're only going to have one column that is going to be a left column, and it'll have a 16 pixel width and a 16 pixel gutter. What we're going to do is use the offset to position it as desired. So our indicator is 28 pixels wide, and we want it to start at the beginning of that. So we'll offset it by 28, And lastly, let's change this color to something that's a little more easily seen, maybe a nice bright green that we can spot easier. It's going to bump up the opacity there as well. And now with this layout grid in place, if we look at our text frame, we can see that it snaps to the left of that. And with this componentized, we can start working on some of the constraints of these different elements. So I'd like to set the text to scale and width with the left and right of the component, and to be vertically centered. With the active indicator, let's pin this to the left and then also to the vertical center. And with the component selected, what we should see is as we affect the width, it'll actually cause the text frame to resize. And this is perfect because we can have text of various lengths within this component. And all we need to do is adjust the width so that everything fits neatly on one line. To illustrate this, we should rename this layer and call it navigation link text. And then what we can do is actually put in that draft of link text. You'll see that I'll break to a new line naturally as things don't fit. So what we can do is come up to our component, and I'm just using Control or Command and the arrow keys to adjust the width as needed. And what you can see is that I'll break to a new line if it doesn't have enough space. So the width that we'll need for this particular instance of text is 102 pixels wide. Now I know we created these link text components earlier, but what I'm realizing is because these are already componentized, they may not react to the left and right constraint to scale as needed within this. So what we might have to do is manually recreate the hover and focus states for each of these variations. So I'm going to clean up this file just a little bit here. And with this active state accounted for, let's drag out a new instance. And what we're going to do is detach it. And we'll use these basic components to build out our default state. So the first thing we can do is get rid of this active indicator. We're just going to have text, but we might want to think through the layout grid that we need to have everything updated accordingly. So one thing I'm realizing is we'll want the text of the default link to sit just inside of the active indicator. So this was 28 pixels wide. I think we want the text to start at 24 pixels from the left. So we can go into our layout grid and let's update the width and gutter of this to be 24. And I'm going to change the offset to be 0. So that way it sits all the way on the left of the component. Next up, we can grab this text frame. Let's drag it over so that it snaps along that layout grid. And lastly, I think one other consideration is we always want this text to be centered within this component. So one way we can guarantee that it's centered is to add an additional layout grid. And let's make sure that this is columns. There will only be one. We're going to want 0 gutter and instead have 24 pixels of margin. What we can do is let's grab this hex value from our other layout grid and apply it here just to make it more visible. And what this will do is always ensure that we have enough width with our component to center this text up and also anticipate this layout change needed to accommodate the active indicator. So you can see we don't have enough width here. What we're going to have to do is adjust the overall width of the component to accommodate this new layout grid. Let's make sure that we have this text frame sized as needed. Looks like we have to bump this down a pixel or two. Resize our text frame, and we're 1 pixel off. So it looks like 106 is what we need. Again, let's make sure everything is nice and resized. Double checking our active variation. Everything's looking good there. I think we're ready to componentize this kind of default state that we have. So componentizing this, I'm going to rename this to just be the normal state of our navigation link. Now as a test, what I'm going to do is drag out an instance of this, and we're going to swap it from the default state to our active state. And you should see that we don't have to change the width of the component to accommodate this layout change, and this should work with any length of text. So that's working well. I think the last thing we need to do is accommodate the hover and focus variations for each of these states, and then we can drag these into our sidebar component and put them into use immediately. Just so we don't get distracted with these layout grids, I'm going to disable them with Control-Shift-4. On Mac, I believe the shortcut is Control-G. Now what we need to do is drag out separate instances of these components so we have hover and focus styles accounted for. So similar process to above with these text components that we probably won't end up using, but really helped us hammer out the process that we'll need. We're going to have to add that text decoration underneath the text for the hover, as well as a color override, and then bring in the focus indicator as well. So what I'm going to do is just grab these elements from these text components, and let's drag it into our default component for the navigation link. Get these centered, and we can pin them to the bottom. I'm going to turn off a couple things here just to make it easier to see what we're doing. So rearranging these layers, I think we actually have everything we'll need. The other states will just have color overrides as needed. With that in place, I think we can get rid of these text components that didn't end up working out, just to make things a little less confusing. So focusing on this hover state of the navigation link, again, we'll want medium contrast. We'll bring in that text decoration at the bottom, and we can componentize this for the normal links hover state. Lastly, let's do the same for the focus indicator. So we bring that in. And if you recall, we'll use medium contrast for the light theme, so that way there's sufficient contrast with the background color. Let's componentize this for the normal and focus state. And those should all be taken care of. And I'm going to get things tidied up in our files as we work. All right, next up we have the active states to anticipate. So I'm going to grab those same two layers, duplicate them. Let's drag them into our active link for the default state. We'll have to do this within the master component. And get our layers rearranged real quick here. I'm going to turn on these two elements and get them aligned as needed. This text decoration should snap to the bottom. And it looks like everything is in place for our remaining states now. So let's work on that hover state real quick. We have the text color to address, so medium contrast. Then we'll bring in the text decoration. That's taken care of. Componentize this, rename it to be the active with the hover state. And lastly, we have to address the focus state. So let's bring in that background color and update the text to be medium contrast for the light theme. Componentize this, rename it to be the focus state, and those should all be taken care of now. All right, let's do one last tidying of our files here, and we'll left align everything as needed. All right, and this should represent the various states of our navigation link. The last thing I want to do at a component stage is get all of these links with their text overrides and instance swapping in place. And that way we can just drop in a navigation links plural component into our sidebar. So creating one last frame here, let's immediately call this navigation links and get the background color applied as needed. I'm going to send this to the bottom of our layers panel. And we can drag in both the default state and the active state. that we'll use to build up the group of links that we'll need for our final sidebar. All right, using our design as reference, let's begin overwriting the text of these components. So we'll have dashboard. Let's make sure the width, if we toggle back on our layout grids using Control-Shift-4, let's make sure our width is as needed. So we're going to have dashboard. We also have company after that. Getting that width adjusted so it just fits on a single line. So we have dashboard, company. Next up would be schedule. Let's make sure we're keeping track of our links here in terms of their order in the layers. We have context up next. Get that width adjusted. Next up will be our active link for the inbox. So that's already in the right position. So we'll say inbox, and then grabbing that parent element, using the control keys to bring down that width till it just fits on a single line. And lastly, we have reports, which we can get in place. And then the final link will be activity. So with those all created, what we can do is establish the vertical spacing that we'll want between these links, which I think I want to be 32 pixels of margin. And with that, we can componentize this whole set of navigation link components and simply call this navigation links. And with that taken care of, what we can do is turn off this layout grid just so we're not distracted. And as a quick test of these navigation link components, you can see that Figma allows us to move these items around. And if we wanted to select a specific link, say if we were mocking up a different view, we can use instant swapping to change it from the normal state to the active state. We don't have to affect the layout in any way or create extra width to accommodate. There's already enough space within the layout to anticipate both variations. A couple things I'm noticing here is that we want to set each of these links within their parent component to be pinned to the left and also reference off of the top. One last thing to check is I believe we forgot to set the constraints of our hover and focus indicators to scale with the actual width of the component. So if we were to swap this for, let's say, the hover state, that looks okay. Let's see if our focus ring, yep, our focus indicator doesn't scale as needed. So let's go in and make sure that is adjusted within the component. So going to our normal link, let's turn on that focus indicator and change it from left to be left and right in terms of scaling. It looks like we already had that set correctly for the text decoration. Let's make sure this focus indicator is also set to be centered vertically. And of course, we have to turn it off for that default situation. So now with that in place, you'll see our focus state automatically updated with the width of our custom text. And so if we go into our navigation links, you can basically mock up any variation that you might want, including changing which page is active and also setting that to be the focus state as well. Looks like we forgot to adjust the focus indicator on the navigation link active variation. So again, let's just make sure that's in place one last time. Going to the parent component for that, set that to left and right, and then center vertically. And now, if we look at everything in our mockup, hopefully that is adjusted as well. Great, so with that all taken care of, let's make sure we have this in the correct state that we're looking for. This will be just the normal default state, and we can just swap this company link back over to the normal default as well. With that all taken care of, not only have we created design documentation as we went with master instances and all of the variations neatly managed, but now we're able to simply drop them in to our refined design and use them immediately. So back in our sidebar here, instead of having this navigation links group, we're just going to delete that. I'm going to change over to the components panel using Alt Option and 2. Let's grab this navigation links component, drop it right in place as needed. Make sure it's part of our sidebar component. And then I'm going to grab this spacer, duplicate it so it comes beneath the logo, use it to quickly space out these links. We can grab these two spacers. And what I like to do is group them in a spacing layer and simply lock it and hide it as needed once they're done being used. And with that, I think all we need to do is left align these links so they match the left of the logo. And from here, I think we are ready to actually componentize the entire sidebar as another component. So with this componentized, what we can now do is set the constraints of each of these nested components. So first off, this spacing layer, I'm going to set to be at the center as well as the top. The logo will also be center and top. And one thing I'm realizing is I always want these two, the logo and the navigation links, to be left aligned to each other. So I might actually group this and rename this to be the sidebar content. And then within this group, we can have both of these always be pinned to the left and the top. This sidebar content will then get centered and then be pinned to the top. Now everything should work as expected. All right, so with all these components and component groups now in our files, let's get these arranged into the recording pages, and then we'll drag in an instance of our newly created sidebar component to finish out this episode. First thing I'm going to do is grab this sidebar frame, and we're going to use move to page to move it to the organisms page. While we're here, I'm going to go to that page and reset its X and Y to 0, just so that way it is neatly arranged in our files. And hitting Shift and 1, we can zoom to fit just to bring that into view. Back in our pages, let's send this logo frame to the atoms page. And I believe we're going to send the navigation links to the molecules page. So on the atoms page, I want to again make sure this is at an X of 0 and a Y of 0. Shift 1 to bring it into view. In our molecules page, let's bring both of these to a Y of 0. We can set them to an X of 0 and just adjust their spacing as needed. So Shift 1, obviously they're overlapping right now. Let's bump this navigation links over so it sits 32 pixels from our single links. Now all of our design system documentation is neatly broken out by type, which keeps everything nice and organized. And the best part is we don't see that cluttering up our actual pages mockups. So the last step here is we want to select this sidebar group. We're just going to delete that completely. Alt Option 2 to go to our components panel and drag in our sidebar organism component. All right, lastly, what we can do with this component in place, it's already constrained to the left and top of our design. So everything is nicely set up for the refined stage of our designs. With that in place, I'm going to check off each of these items in our component inventory, just so we can keep track of what we're doing as we move through each of these layout areas. And with that in place, I think this is a great point to stop for this episode. And in the next episode, we'll probably begin working through this top navigation and global header. So thank you so much for watching. Be sure to check out the next episode, and we'll keep componentizing our design as we go.